My marriage of 13 years was over, delivered to me via PDF attachment in an email while I was deployed in the desert. My name is Nathan. I'm 42 and a staff sergeant with the 82nd Airborne. I was 4 months into my tour in Kandahar when my wife, Becky, decided she was tired of waiting. The subject line of the email read, "Let's be adults about this." The entire message was only 3 sentences long. She informed me she'd already filed the divorce papers, emptied our shared bank account, and moved her new boyfriend, Jeremy, into our house in Spokane. I read the email twice, then closed my laptop. After showering in the communal stalls, I got dressed for my shift without saying a word to anyone. That night, back in my bunk, I replied with a single word, "Understood." That was the end of it. No arguments, no pleading, no threats. My bunkmate, Wilson, noticed my mood. "You good, man?" he asked, without looking up from his book. "Yeah," I said. "Just some stuff back home." He nodded, and that was the end of the conversation. Guys in the military know when to leave things alone. Truthfully, I wasn't surprised. Things had started to shift 6 months before my deployment. The changes were small at first. Becky stopped asking about my day, began working late at the dental office where she was a receptionist, and started going to the gym 3 times a week without ever looking like she'd worked out. There were also new clothes, new friends I never met, and new passwords on her phone. I didn't confront her or start snooping on her messages. That's not my style. But I wasn't oblivious either, so I took my own quiet actions, nothing dramatic, just precautions. I moved important documents, like my birth certificate, marriage license, and the deed to our house, which was only in my name thanks to my VA loan, into a storage unit. I also put my grandfather's watch and my mom's old silverware, things that truly mattered to me, in that same unit. I opened a separate bank account and started diverting a portion of my paycheck there. It wasn't a large enough amount for her to notice, but it was enough to ensure I wouldn't be left with nothing if things went south. The night before I deployed, she hugged me at the airport. "Stay safe, okay?" she said, but her eyes were dry, as if she were saying goodbye to a coworker, not her husband who was leaving for a war zone. I should have known then, but a small part of me still held on to hope. I was wrong. What she didn't know was that I had already prepared for this moment. And what she didn't understand was that I may not start fights, but I always finish them. Becky and I met at a friend's barbecue in 2010. I was home between tours, staying with my buddy Jason in Spokane. She was finishing nursing school, but eventually took an admin job at a dental practice because it was less stressful. We got married 8 months later. Becky used to say she was proud of my military service, though she never quite grasped it. Her dad was a bank manager and her brother was a pharmacist. There was no one in her family with a military background. She'd often ask when I was going to get a real job, not realizing that after 15 years, the Army was my career, not just a job. We bought our 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood in 2014. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. The VA loan was in my name, so I was the only one on the mortgage, but I added her to the deed because that's what married people do. My dad died a year after we got married from a heart attack while shoveling snow. My mom passed away 3 years later from lung cancer, even though she never smoked. They left me some money, not a fortune, but enough for Becky to pay off her student loans and for us to have a nice financial cushion. I deployed 4 times during our marriage, twice to Iraq and twice to Afghanistan. Each time I returned home, Becky seemed a little more distant, a little more restless, as if she was playing a part she no longer fit into. "I didn't sign up to be a military wife," she said to me once after I mentioned re-enlisting for another 4 years. "I'm tired of being alone all the time." I understood. I truly did. But the Army was the only place I ever felt like I belonged. I was good at my job, and people depended on me. In 2019, things started to change again, slowly at first. Becky would get annoyed when I called during her girls' nights. She started talking about how her friend Melissa had divorced her husband and was living her best life. She began making comments about how we didn't really have anything in common anymore. I suggested we try counseling, but she said we were fine, just going through a phase. Then came the late nights at work, the weekends away with friends I'd never met, the new clothes, and the gym membership she rarely used. I should have confronted her, but that's not how I handle things. My dad taught me to think before I speak, and to be sure before I act. So I watched, and I quietly prepared, because my gut was telling me something was coming, and in this life, you learn to trust your gut. 2 weeks after getting the divorce email, I was in the mess hall when my phone buzzed. It was a notification from our bank app, another withdrawal. $8,500. Almost everything that was left. I put my fork down and opened the app. The joint account balance was down to $212.37. Our savings of $47,000, which we had built up over years, was completely gone, transferred to an account I didn't recognize. Murphy, one of the guys from my unit, glanced over at me. "Bad news?" I locked my phone. "Nah, just some account stuff." That night, I used the base phone center to call our bank. It turned out Becky had been moving money for weeks. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. The big transfer had happened the day after I deployed. I hung up and stood in the hallway for a long time, watching other soldiers laughing, calling their kids, their wives, their parents. Normal life was happening all around me, while mine was falling apart. That's when Wilson found me. "Heard from Alvarez that you looked like you'd seen a ghost at dinner," he said. "What's up?" I don't usually share. My marriage about how her friend Melissa had divorced her delivered to me via PDF attachment and an email while I was began making comments about how we didn't really have anything in common anymore. I'm 42 and a staff sergeant we tried the 82nd Airborne, but she said we were fine. I was 4 months into my tour in Kandahar with my wife. Becky then came the late nights at work, tired of waiting. The weekends away with friends I'd never met. The email read, the new clothes, let's be adults, and the gym membership she rarely used. The entire message was only 3 sentences long, but that's not how I handle things. She informed me she'd already filed my dad taught me to think before I emptied our shared bank and account, to be sure before I act, moved her new boyfriend. So I watched Jeremy and I quietly into our house and spoke in because my gut was telling me something was coming. And in this life, my laptop. You learn to trust your gut. After showering in the communal stalls, 2 weeks after getting the divorce I got dressed for my shift. I was in the mess hall when my phone buzzed. That night, it was a notification from our bank app. I replied another with a single word. $8,500. That was the end of it. Almost no everything that was no left. Pleading, no threats. I put my fork down and opened the app. Wilson, the joint account balance was down to $212 and without looking up from his book. Our savings of $47,000, just some stuff back which we had built up over years, he nodded, was completely and that was gone. The end of the conversation. Transferred to an account I didn't recognize. Guys in the military know when to leave Murphy, things alone. One of the guys from my unit, I wasn't surprised. Things had started to shift 6 months before my deployment. Nah, the changes were small at first. Becky stopped asking about my day. The base phone center began working late at the dental office. It turned out Becky had been moving money for weeks and started going to the small amounts 3 times a week without ever looking like she worked out. The big transfer there were also the day after I deployed. New friends I never met. I hung up and stood in the hallway for a long time. I didn't watching other soldiers or start snooping on calling their kids, their wives, not my style. Their parents. But I wasn't normal life was either, happening all so around me. So I took my own quiet while mine was falling apart. Nothing dramatic. That's when Wilson found me. I moved important documents like my birth certificate, marriage license, and the deed to our house. I don't usually share only in my name thanks to my VA loan. But Wilson had my back in a bad situation in Canada. I also put my grandfather's watch and my mom's old silverware. My wife emptied our account and moved her boyfriend into our house in that same unit. I said. I opened a separate bank account
papers
and started diverting a portion of my paycheck there. Wilson didn't offer
wasn't a
any
large
of the
enough
typical
amount for her to
platitudes
notice.
but it was
sorry.
enough to ensure I wouldn't be
That's
left
rough.
with nothing if things
He
went
just
south.
asked.
The
What's
night
your
before
plan?
I deployed,
Not
she
sure
hugged
yet.
me at the airport.
I
replied.
Stay safe,
He
okay?
nodded. She
Let
said,
me know if you need
but her
anything.
eyes were dry,
I couldn't
as if she
sleep
were
that
saying
night.
goodbye to a
I
coworker.
pulled out my laptop,
not her
and
husband,
logged
who
into
was
our
leaving
home
for a
security
war zone.
system.
Something
I should have
Becky
known then,
probably forgot,
but a small
I had
part
remote
of me
access
still
to.
held on to hope.
The camera
I
showed a
was wrong.
strange truck in our
What
driveway.
she didn't know
a
was
man
that
I'd
I had
never
already
seen before
prepared
was
for this
walking our
moment.
dog,
And
using
what she
my
didn't
coffee
understand
mug,
was that I may
and
not
wearing
start
my Seahawks
fights,
sweatshirt.
but I always finished
And there
them.
was Becky.
Becky and I
laughing
met
in
at a
the
friend's
kitchen.
barbecue in
I had renovated
2010.
myself during my last
I was
leave.
home between tours.
Something inside me
staying
shifted,
with my buddy Jason
not
in
anger,
Spokane,
but something colder.
She was
clearer.
finishing nursing school.
I closed the laptop,
but eventually
and pulled
took
out my
an
phone.
admin job
I
at
made
a
a
dental
list.
practice because
Called
it was
James, an
less
old Army
stressful.
buddy who became
We
a
got
lawyer.
married 8 months
Checked
later.
the VA loan terms.
Becky used to say,
contact
she
my
was
master
proud of my
sergeant
military
about
service,
emergency leave,
though she never quite
review the
grasped
home
it.
refinance
Her
documents.
dad
Becky
was a
had
bank
mentioned
manager and her
casually
brother
last
was
year,
a pharmacist,
and checked the
there was
security
no
on
one
my
in her
military
family with a
pension
military
accounts.
background.
I didn't feel
She'd
sad
often
anymore.
ask when I was going
I
to get
didn't
a
even feel angry.
real job.
I felt
Not
focused,
realizing that after
like
15
I was planning
years,
a mission.
the Army was my career.
This wasn't about emotion,
not
now.
just a job. It was about
We
strategy.
bought our 3-bedroom house
at
in a
0500
quiet neighborhood in
before my shift
2014.
started. I sent
It wasn't
an email
fancy,
to James with
but
the
it was
subject
ours.
line. The
Need
VA
legal
loan
help.
was in my name,
Discreet
so
and
I was
urgent.
the only one on the
His
mortgage.
reply came an
but
hour
I added
later.
her to the deed
Call
because
me.
that's what
Secure
married
line
people
only.
do. When
My
I hung
dad
up from
died
that
a
call,
year after we got
I knew
married
exactly
from a
what
heart
I needed
attack
to do
while shoveling snow.
I didn't need to yell.
My mom
threaten,
passed away
or even
3 years
confront her.
later from lung cancer.
I just needed to wait,
even though she
and
never
watch,
smoked,
and let her own
They
actions
left me
become
some
the
money.
trap.
Not a fortune,
2 months later,
but enough
I was
for
back
Becky
on
to pay off
American
her
soil.
student loans.
I didn't
and
tell
for
Becky
us to
I
have a
was
nice
coming
financial
home.
cushion.
I didn't call
I
or
deployed
text
4 times during
I
our
just
marriage.
checked into a motel
twice
in
to
downtown
Iraq
Spokane
and twice to
under a
Afghanistan.
different name and contacted
Each time I
James.
returned home,
We met
Becky
at a diner
seemed a little
10
more
miles
distant,
outside of
a
town.
little more restless.
You look like
as
hell,
if she was playing
he
a
said,
part she no longer
sliding
fit
into the booth.
I
Feel
didn't
like
sign
it
up
too,
to be a
I
military wife.
replied.
She said
James
to me
handed
once
me a
after I
folder.
mentioned re-enlisting
Got
for
everything
another
we
4
discussed.
years.
The house
I'm
deed,
tired of being
loan
alone
documents,
all the time.
bank statements.
I
and this.
understood. He
I
pulled out
truly
a
did.
separate piece of paper.
But the Army was the only
Found
place
something
I ever
interesting when I
felt
was
like I
digging
belonged.
into your finances.
I was good at my job.
It was a refinance
and people
application
depended
with
on
my
me.
signature on it.
In
Except
2019,
it wasn't my signature.
things started to
Not
change
quite.
again.
Someone
Slowly
had
at
tried to
first.
copy it, but
Becky
missed
would
the
get
details.
annoyed when I called during her.
The middle initial was
girls'
wrong.
nights,
and the stroke
she
pattern
started
wasn't
talking
mine.
about how her friend
Becky
Melissa
did
had
this.
divorced her husband
I asked,
and was already knowing
living
the
her
answer.
best life.
James nodded.
She began making comments
months
about
ago.
how we didn't really have
Use
anything
the equity
in common
to pull
anymore.
out $30,000.
I suggested we try
Your
counseling.
signature is required,
but she
for
said
that
we
since
were
the
fine.
VA loan is in
just
your
going
name
through
only.
Forge my signature.
Then came the
take
late
out a
nights at
loan
work,
against our house.
the weekends away
then
with
clear
friends
out our
I'd never
accounts
met,
and divorce me.
the new clothes.
She was a
and the
busy
gym
woman.
membership she rarely
It gets
used.
better.
James
I should have
said.
confronted her.
She listed
But
her
that's
boyfriend
not how I
as a
handle
co-applicant.
My dad
He's-
taught me to think before I speak, and to be sure before I act. So I watched, and I quietly prepared, because my gut was telling me something was coming, and in this life, you learn to trust your gut. 2 weeks after getting the divorce email, I was in the mess hall when my phone buzzed. It was a notification from our bank app, another withdrawal. $8,500. Almost everything that was left. I put my fork down and opened the app. The joint account balance was down to $212.37. Our savings of $47,000, which we had built up over years, was completely gone, transferred to an account I didn't recognize. Murphy, one of the guys from my unit, glanced over at me.
Bad news?
I locked my phone.
Nah, just some account stuff.
That night, I used the base phone center to call our bank. It turned out Becky had been moving money for weeks. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. The big transfer had happened the day after I deployed. I hung up and stood in the hallway for a long time, watching other soldiers laughing, calling their kids, their wives, their parents. Normal life was happening all around me, while mine was falling apart. That's when Wilson found me.
Heard from Alvarez that you looked like you'd seen a ghost at dinner,
he said.
What's up?
I don't usually share.
Got
married
about how her friend
Melissa had divorced and a fraud to me via 2019 in an email.
I took
While
a
I was
cheap
began
break
making comments about how my name is anything in common anymore. I'm 42 and I suggested we try counseling, but she said we were fine. I was 4 months into my tour in Canada with my wife, Becky, and I decided to understand the weekends away with friends. The subject never had the email read. Then here's what we do, and the gym membership she rarely used. The entire message I should have confronted 3 sentences long, but that's not how I handled me. She'd already filed. My dad told me to think before I speak. Our shared bank and to be sure before I watched her new boyfriend. So I watched Jeremy, and I came to our house and spoke because my gut was telling me that wasn't the plan. And in this my laptop. You learn to trust after showering in the communal stall. 2 weeks after getting the divorce dressed for my shift, I was in the mess hall when my
showed him my military ID.
It was a notification from our bank. I replied another withdrawal word
and the forged
$8,500.
That was his face went pale.
Almost no argument. I'll need to report this immediately. I put my fork down. I opened the app. I understand. The joint account balance was down to $200. I've already filed a police report. And without letting out from his book,
I got a text
our savings of $47,000 to at the bank, which we had built up over Jeremy years. Said someone was asking, and that was the end of the conversation. To an account I guys in the military know when to leave things alone. One of the guys from my unit. And I was paperwork contesting the refinance started to shift 6 months. I locked my phone. I also registered a formal notice. Some account no changes could be made. Becky stopped asking about my base phone center. Began while our late at the dental office. It turned out Becky had been moving money for and started going to the small amounts times a week without ever looking like the bank called about the big transfer. There were also new friends I never met. I hung up and new passwords. We can discuss it like adults. I didn't watching other soldiers or start snooping on their kids.
I still didn't.
Their wives, not my style. Their parents.
James called
but
that
I normal life was happening. So I took my own quiet mine was falling apart. Nothing dramatic. That's when Wilson found me. I moved from Alvarez document driving your truck, like my birth certificate, the one in marriage license. He got the deed to our house. I don't, which was only in my name thanks to my but Wilson had my back in a bad situation in Canada. I also put my grandfather's watch and my mom's old
my wife's NTR account
that truly mattered. Prescription pads in that dental office where I opened a separate bank. They weren't papers and started to roll my paycheck there. Wilson didn't. It wasn't a large enough amount for her to notice. Looks that way, but it was enough to ensure. Or I wouldn't. The police are investigating. He just asked.
I hung up
the night before I deployed.
Of the motel.
She hugged me at the airport.
This
I
was
replied,
getting bigger than
safe,
okay?
She said, but her eyes were dry, as if she were saying goodbye to a I pulled out my laptop, not her husband, into our home security system.
Given away
I should Becky probably forgot, but a small part of it still held onto hope. The camera showed a strange truck in our drive. What she didn't know, a man that I had seen before was walking our dog. And what she didn't understand was that I may not wearing my Seahawks sweatshirt, but I always and there was Becky. Becky and I met at a friend's barbecue. I had read about myself during my last. I was home between tours. Something inside me with my buddy, not anger, but something told she was finishing nursing. The other closed the laptop, but eventually pulled out my phone. What happens? I made a list practice because called James. We frozen the funds who became. We got married 8 months, but there's a problem. Becky used to say, "Contact my master sergeant about emergency leave." Though she never quite used a home refinance documents. Her dad was a bank manager and her brother was a pharmacist. And checked the security. There was no one in my military with a military background. I didn't feel I'm not supposed to share that. I didn't even feel angry.
Real job.
It's my house. I thought realizing that after like I was starting a mission. The army was my career. This wasn't about emotion. Not just a job. It was about we bought our 3-bedroom house at 05 neighborhood. These are the transfers out of the finance account. I sent it wasn't emailed to James, but it was ours. Multiple the V alone was in my name,
named
so I was the only one on the mortgage. His reply came an hour
someone
else
I'd never heard
because that's what married Daniel Spencer. When my dad died a year after we got married, I knew exactly what I needed to do. Not my department. I didn't need to yell at my lawyer to wait even years later from lung cancer. I just needed to wait, even though she never smoked, and let her own actions become the trap. Not a few months later, but enough let me back to pay off her student loans.
An hour later,
I didn't tell Becky to have a nice financial cushion. Got it. I didn't call Daniel Spencer is a real estate. I just checked into a motel and specialized twice under a different name and contacted each time I returned home. We met Becky seemed a little more dissatisfied, a little more restless. You look like as if she was playing a part she no longer fit into. The
I feel like
deposits were
sign up
probably
to be a
earnest
military
money to
wife.
get him moving
She
on.
said
James
to me
handed
once
me a
after
full
I
but
mentioned
here's where it
we
gets
got
into for
everything
another
we
4
discussed.
years. Spencer has
The house
done
I'm
business
tired of
with
being
Jeremy
on
Ryan
all the
before.
time. Bank statements.
They've
I
closed
understood.
3 deals together.
He
I
pulled
pulled
out
out
a
a separate piece of paper.
But the Army
I
was the
sat
only
down on
place
the part
I ever
interesting
felt
when I
like
tried
I
to
process
process
your
this.
finances.
I was good at
So
my
this
job.
was a
just
refinance
keeping the
application
papers with
on
my
mine.
signature on it.
In
This was
2009
wasn't my
planned
signature.
operation.
Things started to
Not
change
maybe.
again.
I
Someone
carefully
had tried to copy
orchestrated
it,
one,
but
Becky
Becky
would
would get
James
annoyed
said.
when I called during her.
I
The
did
middle
some
initial
digging
was
girls' nights.
Jeremy Ryan,
And the stroke
she
pattern
started
wasn't
talking
mine.
about how her friends
Becky
involved
said
had
this
women
divorced her
going through a
husband.
divorce
Or
already
with
knowing
living her
spouses.
best life.
James
I
nodded.
found
She began
3
making
cases so
comments
far
about
ago.
how we didn't really
Each
have
time
anything
the
in
equity
common.
to
The
pull
woman's
out
home gets sold
$30,000.
well
I
below
suggested
market
we
value.
try your
on one of
signature is
Spencer's
required.
But she
for
said
that
we
since
were
the
fine.
loan
Ryan
is
gets
in
this
your
going
name
through
only.
her. Then he moves
Babe.
on. Forged my signature.
And
then
Becky,
came the
take
late
out a
nights
loan
of
Did
digging
she know
our
about
house. The
this?
weekends away
Then
with
cleared
friends
out our
that never
accounts.
met and divorced
James
me. The new
replied,
clothes. She was a
and
maybe
maybe
she's
she's
a
a
victim
victim
she
too.
rarely
It gets
used.
better.
Or maybe she
I
should
should
have
have
confronted her.
I
She
reminded
but
her
that's
boyfriend
not how I
as a
handle
co-applicant.
This
wasn't just about
My
Becky
dad taught
betraying
me to think
anymore.
before I speak.
This was something
and to be
bigger,
sure before I
something
act.
calculated.
So I
And
watched,
other military
and I
families
quietly
have been
prepared
victims.
because my gut
What
was
do we
telling me
do?
something was coming.
I asked.
And in this life,
I've already
you learn to
contacted
trust
the
your
FBI's
guy's financial
2
crimes
weeks
division.
after getting the divorce
James
email.
said, I was in
This
the mess
crosses
hall
state
when my phone
lines.
buzzed. Involves military
a
personnel and
notification
via
from our
loans.
bank app.
Another
They're
withdrawal.
interested.
$8,500. Almost everything that was left. I put my fork down and opened the app. The joint account balance was down to $212.37. Our savings of $47,000, which we had built up over years, was completely gone, transferred to an account I didn't recognize. Murphy, one of the guys from my unit, glanced over at me.
Bad news?
I locked my phone.
Nah, just some account stuff.
That night, I used the base phone center to call our bank. It turned out Becky had been moving money for weeks. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. The big transfer had happened the day after I deployed. I hung up and stood in the hallway for a long time, watching other soldiers laughing, calling their kids, their wives, their parents. Normal life was happening all around me, while mine was falling apart. That's when Wilson found me.
Heard from Alvarez that you looked like you'd seen a ghost at dinner,
He said,
What's up?
I don't usually share.
Got
Got
married
about
to
how her
13
friends
friends
in my
who
motel
divorced
room
with
and
a
a
broad
broad chart
chart
thinking about everything
her best
wondering
email.
if Becky
I
while
said
I
that
was
she
laying
began
there
making
in
comments
what
about
are my
how
operating
my name
names
is
gotten
anything
swept
except
up
common
in
I'm
James
42
said,
and
I
established
established
that
that
you
you
can
need
use
second airplane. But she said we were
I was
fine.
4 months
Jack
going
like
through
her
her
in
I
Kandahar
want
with my
Nathan,
weekly mind.
please call me
And I was
decided
not
to
to
understand
understand
saying
the
something
weekends
about
away with
fraud
friends
and
such
Jeremy
every
got
email
arrested
read.
for
The new
driving.
here's
Let's
what we
be
do. And the
adults
gym
about it. I don't
membership
understand
really
what's happening.
the entire
I drove
message
past
was
her
I
and
stared at the
confronted
message
her.
for a
Her
long but that's
boyfriend's
not how
truck
I
was
handled
gone.
me. She'd
Threw
already
his bags
my
in the
dad
car,
told
was
me
in the
to
driveway.
think before
3
I
dots
started
appeared,
and
down
she
the
started
street,
before
and
I
watched
then
her
new
style.
boyfriend. So I watched
I
started
thought
again. I
about
came
not
to our
knocking
house
her
and spoke
and
because my
confronting
gut
her.
was
I
telling
don't
me
know what
was
talking
twice.
about.
And in
closed
this
my
life,
laptop.
you
I
learn to
drove
trust
her
your
down
gut.
showering
And
met
met
with
with my
my
two
law
weeks after
officer.
getting the
I
got
got
dressed for my
processor
shift. I was in the
refinance.
mess
How
hall
worse,
when my
I showed him
phone
my
buzzed.
military
No response.
ID.
It was a
for 10
notification
back in my
from
phone.
our bank.
I
I
replied,
replied
another
another
withdrawal.
withdrawal.
And the forged
I
document.
turned off my phone.
That
His
was
face
his
went
pale.
Almost
No
everything.
argument.
I'll need
No
to
plea
report
call.
this immediately.
No
I
threat.
put my
FBI
fork down
wants
to
that.
my
Open the
bunkmate.
app.
I
They've
understand.
been
The joint
investigating
account
my
balance
reply.
was down to
You
$200.
I've
already
man.
filed a
12
police
You're not the
report.
first.
And
Without
$30
that might
nothing
be
from
the
his
case.
book.
I got a text.
Our
Yeah.
savings of
For the
$47,000
first time,
getting in the
just
bank, which we had
back
built up over
Jeremy
years.
I felt
someone was
close to
and that was the
satisfaction.
end of the conversation.
Not
Not
because
because
my
my
marriage
marriage
was
guys
over
in the military,
but
because
because
the
the
truth
truth
was
I went to the
one of the
county
guys
clerk
from
for
my
money.
unit. I met
I
with
filed
FBI
paperwork
agents at their
contesting the
field. Things
finance
had started to
due to
shift
fraud.
6
I
months
locked
before
I
my
also
telling
registered
agent
no,
Donna. The
normal
changes
notice.
were
Some
slow.
account
They
notice
reported my
changes could be
statement.
made.
That
Becky
night,
stopped
I
asking
used
about
the
all the
documents
documents
began
changed.
while
2
our
days
night at the
later,
dental
Becky
office.
told
Turned out
she was
Becky had been
upset. I let
moving
it go
money
to
and
voicemail.
started going
Agent
to the
was
small
every
amounts at
time
first.
we
We
meet
meet
without
without
larger
larger
ones,
like
like
a
a
bank
bank
called
account.
about
The
the
big
house.
transfer
They
were
were
also
also
news
news
rather
rather
than
than
isolated
friends I
incidents
never
about
about
hung
the
up and
divorce
stood
and knew
up
how we
back
could
for a
discuss it
long
like
time.
adults.
I asked, I didn't
Watching
confess
other
my
souls
words
or
on
start
her email,
snooping on
calling
her
their
messages.
kids.
The
I still
agents
didn't
expressed
their
that's
wives,
not my style.
their parents.
We're
James
still
called
but I
that
wasn't
normal
life
level
was
of
happening.
involvement.
They
All
so I
around
took
my
my
own
own
quiet
quiet
actions.
actions falling apart.
He
Nothing
said,
dramatic.
that's
That's
financial
financial
difficulties?
Your
I'm
wife's
moved
pressure
to
is
sell
not
the
in
house
driving
like
your truck.
my
My
birth
birth
certificate,
certificate, the one in
marriage
your name,
license.
kept saying we
He
got
got
a
the
deed
deed
to our
house
house.
for it.
I don't usually
was
share
only
my
my
name
stuff.
thanks to my
I
didn't
didn't
have my name
they
to
have
our
our
mortgage payments were
I
manageable
also
on
put
my
my
grandfather's
grandfather's
watch
watch
and
and
he
money
also
notes
my
silverware.
wife's
Things
things that truly mattered
moved
prescription
about
passed
6
in
months
that
ago.
dental office
I
where
said
Becky
I
opened
opened
a
a
separate
separate
bank
bank
account and started to bring
and I
her
rolled
my
my
paycheck there.
Donovan
Well, she
asked.
didn't.
It wasn't a large
amount
amount
for her to know it looks that way,
I'm
but it was enough
sorry,
to
my
ensure
signature
I
while
wouldn't
the
believe
police
it.
are
Investigating.
They
They
asked
more questions.
I hung out
At night
before
before I
the edge
deployed,
of the motel
he
bed.
hugged me at the airport.
Padilla
Still
was
handing
fine.
me her
Stay
car.
safe,
He
okay?
nodded.
We'll be in touch.
Let
her
me
know if you need
but her eyes
anything.
were dry.
Don't
I as if she were
confront
saying
your
goodbye
wife.
to a
I
coworker.
pulled out my
Not
laptop,
her
and
husband,
house,
into our
my
home
dog,
security
my life.
system.
Given away
Something
as
Becky
a
probably
not
forgot.
but a small
I had remembered
prize
drove to
still
our
helps
neighborhood
with the path
again.
now.
The camera
And
showed
I
us
was
flying
couldn't
street
trust
by hour
what
drive.
she didn't know.
Jeremy
I
said
had
I had
never
seen
seen
before.
was
He
the
must
next
have
dog.
gotten it out of him.
I
And
met
what
with
he
the
didn't
bank
understand
Becky's
is
called
that I
me
may
and
not
wearing
start
my short
seeing off
guy
my phone, but I always
and there was
a text from
and
Becky and I met
on
at a
his
friend's
feet.
barbecue.
I had
in
been
2010
myself
during my last
I was
week.
home
Tomorrow.
said,
Something
11
inside
a.m.
stayed
with
with
my
my
buddy's
not
desk.
anger. Spokane.
But
I showed the
vows
text
that
she was
she was
finishing nursing.
the other
I
spouse
closed the
days
laptop,
and
but eventually
don't
stopped my
go.
admin
What
job.
happens?
I
I
made a list.
Nothing
because
because
called
come
James.
from talking
We
to
froze
a
the
right
everybody
now.
who became
I got
married 8 months.
checked,
But
but
there's
there's
a long term.
But I
Becky
want
used
to
some
know
of the
that
contacts
you
from
and
Master
Dave
Sergeant
are
about
military
emergency
leave.
leave. Though she never
drove
drove
to
to
our
our
house
house
at
refinanced
9:30
her dad
a.m.
was a
Becky
bank
had
card
cash
and her
last
brother was
year.
a
Eileen
pharmacist.
said
And
check
checked
the
there was
security.
no
Where
one
did
in
it
the
go?
family amount of
Thompson
got in my car.
hesitated
I
and
didn't drove
drove
away.
away.
I'm not
Heading
supposed to
toward
share
the
that
I
information.
didn't
Even feel angry.
Real job.
It's my
What?
house.
I
Not
finally
realizing
realized
that after
like I was
money
starting
now
a
we
mission.
wait. The army was
I
like,
said,
this wasn't about emotion.
90
minutes
minutes
later. It was
Then
about we
Darby
brought
brought
up
up
with a
with a
real
real
estate
estate
agent
agent
in a quiet
on
neighborhood.
these are the
Before my
transfer
started
values
finance account.
I sent
It wasn't
Jeremy
mailed to
I
me,
scanned
but
the
it was
subject
ours.
line.
They talked to
Multiple
the three
emails
loaners
to
in my
someone
name.
named
Went
Danny
inside. So I was
Danner.
the only
Should
one
I
on the
call
move.
them?
Reply came an
But
hour
someone
later
else
after
I'd
the
never
deed
heard
because
of.
I
I
shook
shook
my
my
hand.
hand.
Who's
Line
Daniel
only.
Spencer?
No need.
When
My
I hung
dad
up,
died
I pulled out
here
my
after
phone.
we
I
got
knew
married.
exactly
I
what I needed
installed
to know.
security
Shut
cameras
up.
last
I didn't
year.
need
But
to
you should
yell
have
at my
interior
liars
and
or
security
even years
credit.
later from
They
Montana.
uploaded-
I
I
needed
called
to wait,
James
even though
as
she
soon
never
as I left the
and
bank.
let her own
They
action
left me
Daniel
some
Spencer.
mention that before.
Not a
I
few
repeated,
months later,
never
but
came
enough
let
was
me
back
back
on
on
pay
pay.
off
I
her
said,
student
an
loan.
hour
Opening
later,
I didn't
and
tell
for
Bex
all
to have a
back
nice
on payment
financial
was
cleaning,
got it.
so
I
James
didn't
called
Daniel
Spencer
Spencer
is
is
a
a
real
real
estate
estate
attorney.
agent
We're in our living
twice
room.
Better Rock and
Twice
twice
over
over
taking
different
cash
cash
and
deals.
contacted
And Jeremy,
Jeremy
she was
returned
planning
home.
to sell
We
her
Becky
house.
dined a little more
A realization
a little
had
more
like
restless.
physical
You
blood
look
like
as
hell.
if she was playing a
Look,
part
I've
she
got
no
a
longer
fire
fitted
head
into.
already.
The
I know
deposit
like
was
fine
probably
items
earnest
I
money
replied,
to get
how
him
much?
moving
She
on.
said
James
to me
handed
once
Jeremy
after
a
I
but
mentioned
here's where it
real
gets
estate
tricky for
money
another
was
4
discussed.
years. Spencer has
The house
done
is
business
tired of
with
being
Jeremy
$470,000
all the time.
bank statements.
They've
I
closed
understand.
3 deals
For
together.
$400,000
Pulled out a
$400,000
piece of paper.
But the Army was
sat
the
down
only
on
place
I ever
interesting
felt
when I
like
learned about
taking
your
husbands.
finances.
I was
Becky
good at my
said
job.
it was a
refinance
refinance
application with my
signature
signature
on
weight.
it.
This
In
was accepted
2009
wasn't my
military
operation.
guys
Things
are
started
all
not
the
maybe
same.
in.
They
Someone
carefully
had tried to copy
orchestrated
but
it.
they
But
got
Becky
Becky
would
would
get
get
annoyed
annoyed
when I called during the
I
middle
didn't
initial
dig
girls'
He'll
night.
take a
Jeremy
settlement
Ryan.
and the
To make
stroke
it
started
better,
as a
wasn't
pad
mine.
about how her
I
friends
took
and
Becky
Ball
to
had
this
women
going
going
through
through
the
divorce
divorce,
already
living
knowing
our
already
best
recording the
life.
feed.
James
I
found
found
three
began making
cases every
comments
month
about
ago.
how we didn't really
I
have
told
time
you
to
the
think
equity
through
to
the
pull
woman's
out
taxes.
$30,000
I
below
suggested
market
we
value.
track
Your
down one of
signature is
Spencer's
happening
but
here.
she
But
said
that
we
since
were
the
fine.
vehicle
Ryan
is
gets
his
just
name
going through
only.
it.
Our
Then he
house
moved
was
on.
surrounded
My
by
signature.
and
Then
then
came the
take
late
out a
nights of
loaner.
digging
I
into
watched
our
the
house
weekends
down the
away
Everything
with
with
clear
credit
out our
cards and
accounts
met and
and
divorced
James
me and
replied,
Jeremy out.
she
and
was a
handed
maybe
me
she's a
membership
victim.
to
She
my
barely
phone
gets
ring.
better.
Or maybe she
I
should
should
have
have
confronted her.
I
She
rubbed
listened
but
to
that's
my
not
boyfriend.
how I
That's
handled
how
this
I
wasn't
schemed.
just about
My
Becky
dad
using
taught
me
me to think
anymore.
before
Plus
I
conspiracy.
speak.
This was
And
something
to be
big.
sure before I
Something
act.
attempting to sell
So I
property and
watched.
other
And
military
I
families
quietly
have been
prepared.
victims.
Because my gut was
formal
telling me
statement
something
from
was
you.
coming.
I asked,
And
of
in this
course,
life,
I've already
you learn to
contacted
trust
the
your
FBI. And
FBI's
Mr.
financial
Briggs, 2
crimes
weeks
your
after
wife
getting
just
the
arrived
divorce
and
email.
said, I was in
This
the midst
crossed
of
the
all
street.
when my phone buzzed. I looked down the street. It was a notification
Becky
via
from
standing
bank
on our lawn.
Another
Her
withdrawal.
hands over her mouth.
$8,500.
Watching as FBI agents carried boxes
Almost
of
everything that
documents
was
from our
left.
house. I put
What
my fork
happens to
down
her?
and opened the app.
I asked.
The joint
That
account balance
depends.
was down to
Patel said.
$212
On what she knew and on what you want.
cents. I watched
Our
Becky
savings
for a
of
long
$47,000,
13 years of
which we had
marriage,
built up over
good
years
at the beginning, was completely gone, transferred to an account I didn't recognize. Murphy, one of the guys from my unit, glanced over at me.
Bad news?
I locked my phone.
Nah, just some account stuff.
That night, I used the base phone center to call our bank. It turned out Becky had been moving money for weeks. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. The big transfer had happened the day after I deployed. I hung up and stood in the hallway for a long time, watching other soldiers laughing, calling their kids, their wives, their parents. Normal life was happening all around me, while mine was falling apart. That's when Wilson found me.
"Heard from Alvarez that you looked like you'd seen a ghost at dinner,"
he said.
"What's up?"
I don't usually share. Before whatever this had become.
I just want what's right. I just want what's right.
The federal case moved quickly. Jeremy and Spencer both implicating each other, and several other conspirators in what turned out to be a three-state operation targeting military families. Becky maintained that she knew nothing about the larger scheme. She said Jeremy had convinced her I was hiding money, and planning to leave her with nothing, that the refinance was his idea, and she had just gone along with it. Maybe that was true. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe either way, she agreed to a settlement. She agreed to a restitution of the stolen funds, forfeiture of any claim to the house, or my military pension, and a signed confession about the forgery. In exchange, I didn't press charges. The divorce was finalized 6 months after that email from Kandahar. Clean break. A no-fault. On the day the last paperwork was signed, I got a call from Agent Patel. Jeremy Ryan was sentenced today. 8 years
today.
for fraud,
8 years for
conspiracy,
fraud,
and identity theft.
Spencer got 12.
Thought you'd want to know. I said.
Thank you. There's something else. We found evidence they'd done this to 11 other military families. Your case helped us build the pattern. Those families might get their money back because
After we hung up, I sat on the porch of my rental apartment, watching the sunset and thinking about those other families, other men who deployed, thinking their homes and marriages were safe, only to come back to emptiness. I hadn't planned on being the one to bring down Jeremy and Spencer's operation. I just wanted what was mine. But sometimes things work out in ways you don't expect. My phone buzzed. A text from Becky.
I never meant for things to end this way.
I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. A year later, I sold the house. I couldn't stand to live in it anymore. There were too many memories. And too much betrayal in those walls. I used the money to buy a small cabin outside of Missoula. 2 bedrooms, 10 acres of land, 10 acres of land behind it, a creek running behind it, and no neighbors for miles. I took early retirement from the Army. 20 years was enough. I'd given enough. I got a German Shepherd named Scout, and started doing carpentry work for locals. Nothing fancy. But it kept my hands busy and paid my military pension covered the rest. Sometimes I thought about Becky. Wondering where she ended up. James heard she'd moved back to her hometown, working at another dental office. Starting over, I guess. I didn't hate her anymore. I didn't really feel anything about her. She'd made her choices. And so had I. I got a letter from a woman in Her husband was in the Navy. Deployed when Jeremy and Spencer tried to run their scheme on her. The FBI had given her my name as part of the case.
You don't know me. But you saved our home. Thank you for fighting back when it would have been easier to just walk away.
I read it twice. I pinned it to my refrigerator. Some days, when the silence got too loud, or the memories too sharp, I'd look at that letter and remember that something good had come from all of it. Last I heard, Jeremy was still in prison. And so was Spencer. The system worked for once. As for me, I was finding my way forward. One quiet day at a time. Building something that couldn't be stolen, or betrayed, or forged. Something that was just mine.